Alright, so what we're going to be focusing on today is rebuilding a TurboSmart dual port blow-off valve. So you can find these for various vehicles, Subarus, pretty much anything that you're looking to rebuild, but the most common one ends up being Mazda Speed and Subaru platforms. This is one that has a specific flange for a Mazda Speed. I believe can also be used on a Legacy, so Subaru Legacy GT or some later GR chassis Subarus. But what we're going to focus on today is rebuilding this because there are seals inside of this that do go bad. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and start with disassembly. So with this, I generally recommend taking the trumpets off, and then also if you have a block off plate on the back half of this, or a recirculating nozzle or what have you, go ahead and take those off. It'll help getting a little bit better grip on the blow-off valve itself. This is also a good time to get just a handful of paper towels and then clean out all of this gunk that tends to accumulate in here. Another thing that you can do is you can actually hold off on that. We can take this and spray it out with some brake clean and get some of the grease and debris and dirt that accumulates over time off of it. The next thing you'll want to do is, because we've taken those trumpets and the caps off, gives you a little bit better capability to hold on to this. Now you're going to want to make sure you have a really good grip, or have it set down on something flat. In this case, we've got my desk and I've got a mouse pad here to protect the desk from this. It's a very sturdy object. So we'll go ahead and start unscrewing this. Now what you'll need to do is make sure that you are holding a fair amount of force down. This is and can be where you get hurt. So there is a huge spring in here with a lot of pressure. So you'll want to be very careful as you take it apart, because once you get to that last thread, it's going to come loose. So slowly work this up. Never look directly over top. Always work away from these. Same thing goes with wastegates. Whenever you're taking the springs out of those. So there we go. All right, so we've got the cap here. Now this can get a whole bunch of grease and dirt and build up in it as well, so I recommend taking just a paper towel. In this case, I've got a whole bunch here, and we can just quickly wipe this out. So you've got all that crap that accumulates over time in here. Again, you can spray this out with brake clean if you want, but just a paper towel, maybe a little bit of isopropyl alcohol will do all the cleaning that you really need to do. In most cases, if you have had an engine that's like spat a whole bunch of oil in here, go ahead and clean that out. You're going to need to clean the spring as well. A little bit of oil does help, keeps things from corroding, so I do generally lubricate these whenever I put them back together. Just a little bit of like machining oil or what have you, making sure that everything kind of stays happy, smooth operation, doesn't corrode. So we'll take that spring and set it off to the side. Again, it is a massive spring that is compressed in a very small space, thus the reason it is pretty dangerous to take this apart if you're looking over top of it. So have a good grasp on it and making sure that you're not going to launch this cap across the room. So once that's done, we can see one of our first seals on the blow-off valve. So we've got this rubber seal right here. This is what seals on the inside flat edge of this cap, and that's what keeps air from leaking out whenever this is being used on your vehicle. And you can feel that with a nice tight seal. Now, a lot of times as time goes on and these age, these get scored up pretty bad. So what I recommend doing is, whenever you want to rebuild one of these, stop by your local Harbor Freighter. You can actually get these seals from TurboSmart. You can order them on Amazon. I'll probably go ahead and throw a link to that on the video here, just so that it's easier to find. But you can basically repurchase these seals, because they do harden, they do tend to crack or weaken or scratch over time, and then they start leaking. When they leak, then your tuner is going to say, hey, you know, we're not getting the accurate air-fuel ratios. Makes my life easier whenever people just do the service. And I recommend doing this like once a year if you can. Even though it may seem a little bit wasteful, it is well worth it, because an air leak from one of these is sometimes hard to find and can cause a lot of mayhem. So that's the first seal. We're going to go ahead and start working into some of the other seals here. If you reach in, you can do this with a pick. I really recommend not doing it with a pick, just use a finger. But go ahead and put your finger into this bore. You'll feel a ledge on the piston that moves up and down, and you'll go ahead and just chase that out of there. Now, be careful, do not get dirt on this piston. Make sure it's always kept clean, because inside this bore, if you get dirt in here, debris, stones, sand, honestly anything, it'll start to scratch. This is pretty soft aluminum. It can scratch pretty easy. This is a brass, sometimes steel piston. So we'll go ahead and set the blow-off valve body over here. So this piston has a seal on the bottom. Not only is this meant for, as it travels downward, softening the blow. If you hear it, it's not metal on metal there. So that's meant to provide a proper seal at the bottom as this is operating up and down. The sides here, you want to make sure that these aren't scored up. So just make sure that everything is clean, everything looks good. If there's big digs in the side of this, you may need a new piston. If there are big digs in the side of this blow-off valve bore, you may need to look into a new blow-off valve. So that's why we want to service this, to keep that from happening, give it a really happy, useful lifespan. Now what I generally do is just wipe the piston off here with a paper towel, sometimes spray down a little bit of brake clean, just to make it easier, because these do get greasy, they get kind of gross. They get covered in carbon and all sorts of other oil crap. So it's good to just clean them off. And then you'll see like they do have a pretty nice little coating on them. And this is as it sits here. So what we'll want to do is actually take this seal off. Now again, you can use like a generic O-ring kit. You want to make sure it's either a metric kit or it's the specific O-rings that are made by TurboSmart for this blow-off valve. So you'll want to take this out. This is in a groove. Now make sure that whenever you're taking this out, you're using something that's sharp but not going to pierce or damage this rubber. You may need to actually reuse this at some point if your O-rings do not fit. So I always recommend better safe than sorry. Make sure everything is taken apart with care. So that's one of the seals that we need to worry about. And then we can move on to disassembling the body of the blow-off valve here. What you'll need is an Allen key. I believe it's a 5mm, it might be a 4mm Allen key. But we'll just crack these bolts on the bottom loose. We don't want to loosen them all the way yet. Sometimes these get seized up a little bit. And you just want to loosen them so that just part of the bolt head is poking out. Once you have that, you may feel the base of the blow-off valve actually start to move a little bit, like it may be able to move around. Sometimes these get a little bit stuck, especially if they've been on the car for a real long time. So what you want to do is you want to just pull on that until it frees up, and then you can move the body of the blow-off valve around. Don't move this around too much, because again, there can be some debris that gets stuck in here over time. So what we'll go ahead and do now is actually take the rest of these bolts out, take them out all the way. And once we have that done, it's going to release the flange and then the two capturing blocks that hold the body of the blow-off valve in place. Something that you might want to do before you start loosening this is just mark where your blow-off valve is oriented so it's easier to put back together to fit on your car. Because again, in order to rotate this blow-off valve, we need to loosen these screws to be able to clock it the way that we want. Once those screws are out, go ahead and set the blow-off valve flange side down on a soft surface and lift the body out. You'll see these capture blocks, aluminum, beautifully machined aluminum blocks. Now you can actually see here, there's some kind of scum and dirt that's built up over time in these locations. And same thing with the inside of this flange here. So you want to go ahead and clean this out. But our last seal is this O-ring on the bottom. Now this one tends to be the one that leaks a lot because these screws tend to work loose sometimes. And this is, again, it's a very thin O-ring. I either recommend getting the actual O-rings from TurboSmart. Sometimes you can clean these and just kind of touch them up and then put them back in place and they'll seal fine. But I do recommend going with new O-rings, either from an O-ring kit purchasing the right size O-rings, taking these into your parts store and matching them up, or just ordering right from TurboSmart. So again, that's kind of the walkthrough on these seals. We'll go ahead and walk through putting it back together. I haven't put new seals on it yet, but this will give you kind of the general rundown. Again, as you're working through this, just take these apart, try and clean them as best you can. This has been sitting in the garage for a while, so it hasn't actually been on a car in a few years. So it's really just collecting garage dirt. But once we have that wiped down, place the seal on the outside of this inner ring. Then we can go ahead and place these aluminum blocks in the groove on the side, holding those together, and then placing them down in the flange. Actually, first we're going to wipe out this flange. This has got a fair amount of corrosion in it. There we go. So we'll go ahead and pick this up again, place our O-ring seal, make sure it's flat, not bound, not twisted. Place our 2 aluminum retainers, align them up, and drop it down in. And that will align our holes so we can put our screws back in. We're going to line this back up the way we had it. Drop these screws in. Now we're not tightening these down all the way yet. We're just snugging them up so they're barely starting to really pull down on those retainers. All right. Now we'll go ahead and just give this a little bit of rotation, make sure everything's nice and free, don't hear any crunching or material that is stuck in that seal. Then we can go ahead and just very lightly snug up both sides of this blow-off valve retainer. All right, that's all it needs. It doesn't need to be super tight, just needs to be nice and snug. That way this doesn't rotate easily. Now our next series of events will be loading the piston back in the bore. And I recommend using just a little bit of machining oil on this piston to help it kind of glide into place. And drop it down. It'll engage on the seat on the bottom. Then we can take the spring and make sure this is aligned and flat on the bottom. Then take our cap. Again, there's a little notch in the top there. We'll want to make sure it's aligned and flat on the cap, so that it should sit balanced like so. And then what you'll want to do is very carefully guide this straight down onto the threads. Rotate until you feel it engage the thread. Sometimes it'll take a little bit of work, but turn it to loosen it. You'll feel it kind of lock down. There we go. All right, now you can turn to tighten. And once you've got that first thread, turn it a couple times just to make sure you're safe, and then you should be good. So then you can just tighten it down a little bit further. Set it to how you had it adjusted on the vehicle. Take your finishing pieces like the trumpets or the caps that go in the blow-off valve. Put those back on once they're cleaned. And there you go. A rebuilt TurboSmart dual port blow-off valve.